Richard Stark, who will speak to us from Stark Coast 3D on why man-made structures on the UKCS are not reefs and how to change this.
Okay. Okay. Well, thank you for letting me speak today. I suppose my background, I have a sort of environmental science background. I've done a master's in engineering. Spent 15 years doing decommissioning oil and gas structures in the North Sea. And recently, I've just completed, in fact, I graduate my PhD on Thursday. So that's what I'm going to present today. So that's the title of my PhD below. And I'm just, and then above what I'm going to talk to you about today, which is just one part of it. So I'm interested, my PhD, I'm interested in law and policy associated to decommissioning on the UK continental shelf. That's a policy that aims to leave a clear seabed, but ultimately will leave about 4 million tonnes of steel and concrete on the seabed that it refers to as remains and residues, or are marked as obstructions, and those will be there for about 1,000 years. As the regime did not expect this legacy to be created, it didn't make any provision for its management going forward, so there's no standards or anything like that as to how you're going to manage it. So instead of looking at how to do that, the government imposed a liability in perpetuity upon oil and gas companies. But obviously, as oil and gas companies are commercial entities, they are unable to discharge an unlimited liability, and so the government has therefore also asked someone to come up with a mechanism to devise this. So 25 years after the first asking, none has been forthcoming, and so my PhD seeks to resolve this. The most obvious solution is obviously to create a fund of some sort, but where will the money come from? And rigs to reef is one of 9 scenarios that I've costed as potential options. So firstly, I'll kind of run you through some of the artificial reef stuff that I kind of collated, some of which you will know, and I'll go into the Brent spar, why that's created a problem, how to resolve it potentially, and then maybe a need, how we could benefit from it. So this was, I went through a kind of inventory of artificial reefs, or all kind of looked around as much as I could find, and I found that of 234 countries or dependent territories, these are things with their own legal regimes or regulatory regimes, 115 or 49% had artificial reefs that had been approved in some way by a government organisation. In the North Sea, it was kind of consistent as well, so we have a lot of reefs by both OSPAR and non-OSPAR members in seas managed by governments and therefore some form of approval. And even in the UK, I managed to find 8 examples of artificial reefs that are used for a variety of different things. And I also found that there's a regulatory pathway away that we could go and do this in the UK by a guy, Tim Wilding, and Mr. Sayre. Tim Wilding, I met him last year at this conference. It's a wee bit like sort of meeting your hero when you've been studying this stuff for like 6 years. So a potted history of artificial reefs. So when I looked at the inventory, I kind of broke them down. So I ended up with a kind of first generation, which is the kind of fishing devices that have been around for years or for centuries in various sort of degrees of development. And then repurposing, so creating what would have been waste, try to turn it into something better. So reuse would be the purpose of it, so high up in the waste hierarchy. The other next one is rather than using waste, is creating new material and adding that in, generally concrete. And the fourth one was where you're growing growing reefs rather than waste. So using electrochemical reactions and microfragmentation techniques. Obviously, in terms of rigs to reef, we're interested in the second one, which is repurposing something that would otherwise be waste. But then also, when we look at nature-positive offshore wind farm designs, that looks at the next two. So effectively, we have rigs to reef, which is second generation, and then in wind farms, when we incorporate nature-positive designs, reefing effectively into our structures, we then sort of accept the benefit of reefs. So why is there no UK Rigs to Reef programme, and what are we going to do at the end in 50 years when we decide that we don't need our wind farms anymore and we've created these lovely reefs? So the reason everything in decommissioning effectively goes back to the Brent Spar. It happened in 1995. Greenpeace protesters boarded the Brent Spar, accusing the owners of trying to dump waste at sea, caused a media storm, public protest, overturned what had been an accepted science-based proposal that had been developed based on international provisions. But importantly, it didn't include consultation with the public. So there was specific set requirements of people to engage, but not a kind of wider public engagement. Therefore, it was a bit of a surprise in many ways. But what it did was it turned at what initially had been a technical challenge. So what should we do, what could we do, and what can we do, and what's the best kind of technical assessment, into one of public policy. So effectively perception over fact. It also included a kind of link of artificial reef research to dumping, when the leader of the Greenpeace protests linked it to artificial reefs, which wasn't part of the decommissioning programme. And what that did is it led to the cancellation of a pilot project on the Odin project, or the Odin platform in Norwegian waters that had been due to take place at the time. There's a whole kind of timeline of this by a lady called Dolly Jorgensen that you can look up on the internet. Oh, sorry, yeah. And when you end up with a problem of public policy that's meant to be resolved by a technical endeavour, that's what you call a wicked problem. You can kind of look that up as well. So that's how I classed this and how I kind of approached it. But effectively, the regime, Brent Spar didn't really change the regime, the kind of high-level legal, international or domestic law. What happened along at the same time was the OSPAR agreement came into place that had been signed in 1982 and came into force in 1998 thereafterwards, introduced the precautionary principle, which effectively you defer conducting activities that might be harmful until the science is there. And it also talked about the ecosystem approach, which is a kind of holistic, regional kind of approach to environmental management. But didn't change the basis of either these or the past laws. But what it did do was it introduced political assumption into policy that made it inflexible. So normally the law would be relatively flexible, so you can change, and this introduced inflexibility. There's examples of the Brent Spar, the OSPAR decision 98.3, where they decided that onshore disposal was generally preferred to offshore disposal. There's no reason behind that, so you can't really challenge it because there's no basis for it for you to either agree or challenge. There was the artificial reef guidelines that went along at the same sort of time that you said that you comprised of kind of virgin materials. Again, no reason as to why virgin materials should be used over other ones. And most importantly, the ones I'm going to talk about are the decommissioning guidance notes, which were produced. They're basically an interpretation of all the policies by the Secretary of State. And he interpreted the precautionary principle rather than the definition by OSPAR. He said that it was to be a clear seabed. No reasoning again why that was. And also the requirement to apply a case-by-case approach, which in this case has kind of come out as a field-by-field rather than ecosystem-based approach. What you should note is that treaties and statutes are very difficult to reopen, because once you open them once, then everyone goes, everything comes up for negotiation. Whereas when you look at these decisions and guidelines, these are much easier to do so, because you either approach one thing at a time, or you can kind of do it not under the radar, but without so much kind of consultation. So the problem that exists is that the tools that we use to decide the best way to decommission are based upon the policy. So in the comparative assessment here on the right-hand side, which most of you probably understand, this is how we select the best decommissioning approach. But if you apply a clear seabed as the basis to that, it means that anything else is worse. So regardless of what science you come up with, you're always going to find a clear seabed to be better. Whether it is better or worse from your science, you physically cannot do it in a comparative assessment. It will always kick out the clear seabed is best, so removal. The second is that the decommissioning programmes are developed on a case-by-case basis, which means a field-by-field basis, which in time means that you're basically looking at the local problems as opposed to the ecosystem as a whole. And therefore, you lose things like the connectivity that Insight's always talked about. All that kind of stuff doesn't get considered within how you're developing your comparative assessment. And not only, if you look at this from an environmental perspective, does this kind of skew the results, it actually does it for everything else. Because actually, if you do less, so like artificial reefing, technically it's safer because you've got less people offshore, you're creating less emissions, you're not making risks of major project failure, you're not spending as much money, all that kind of stuff. So that's the kind of fundamental problem, I suppose. And how I, in my PhD, how I suggest that we do this, so going back to the idea that we can alter kind of guidelines and that kind of stuff much easier than we can law. If we look at the guidance notes, these interpretation by the Secretary of State, so effectively what could happen is David Miliband could wake up tomorrow and say, actually, yeah, the precautionary principle doesn't mean a clear seabed. What it means is OSPAR's definition of the precautionary principle. And he would be able to then, the definition would be changed, it would go through a sort of small piece of consultation, and then you would have a different way of assessing it. And if you did that, then if you look at the precautionary principle, it would mean that your precautionary measures are meant to be taken when there are reasonable grounds for concern that human activities may bring hazards to living resources in the marine ecosystems. Well, I think that exists through the Insight work. So you could say, yes, we've got to stop, shouldn't remove anything just now until we've done more science. So, and then work out what's best. So I'm not proposing this will give you the answer, I'm suggesting this would be a better way to present it. And then if we applied a ecosystem-based approach as opposed to case-by-case approach, rather than doing an environmental assessment of each field at its time, at a specific time, as an independent entity, you would do a North Sea environmental, an ecosystem-based North Sea environmental appraisal. Yeah, that would then consider the impact not just of removing your own structure, but of removing them all at once. And so, finally, so I think I've told you a way that I think you could solve it, and then I kind of pose a question. So my first degree, I did something about island biogeography. It's by a chap, MacArthur and Wilson, in 1967. And effectively, what it tells you is that the mainland is the kind of high populations of individuals and lots of diversity. Small islands have less resources and therefore less individuals, or can host less individuals. Larger islands have more, and so can do that. The smaller islands, though, you get effectively hit by less than a larger island by a colonising species. So lower diversity in small islands, higher diversity in large islands. And also the same works when you're closer to the shore as further away from the shore. Now, they obviously based this on a kind of land-based thesis, so like birds flying off the shore to get to wherever. But if you apply that to the marine environment, if you look at the territorial sea waters closer to where we are, they're highly productive. They're in the photic zones, so we have higher diversity and more productive environments. If you look in the middle part, the oil and gas, where the platforms are, you can see the fields. Obviously, the platforms are tiny, tiny pieces of that. Yeah, they're about 100 metres squared, the footings. So there's effectively small islands that are far from the mainland. And then, if you look at the offshore wind farms, we see that they are much closer in. So they are much bigger and much closer in to the mainland. And therefore, large islands, so should have larger populations and higher diversity. And then I kind of pose the question, I suppose, at the end, is it worth spending £15 billion or half of that will be taxpayers' money, to remove all these oil and gas platforms, when actually in 50 years' time, it's highly unlikely that we're going to remove the wind farms because of these. These should be phenomenal reefs that run up the whole of the east coast of the UK. So that's my kind of final question for you, and the end.